Hi, I'm Chris Caligari. Welcome to Ultimate Wildlife Gardens. This video is about trees and shrubs, particularly trees and shrubs that are best for wildlife. Now this video is for you if you've got a large garden, a small garden, or even, believe it or not, if you've got no garden at all. There's a huge role that you can play. Now, what trees are best for wildlife? Well, I will give you a few recommendations, but particularly, or most importantly, is the why. I'm also going to give some pointers to some trees and shrubs which I would say are best avoided or of limited value. And I want to finish up with, vitally important, the threats to existing trees and how we can help. And that's when all of us, whatever size garden or with no garden, can make a huge contribution. Oh, and lastly, I'd like to just address one or two remarks to people who've been kind enough to subscribe to the channel, who I regard as friends. So this is for you, and I believe people that share our common view. Now, it may sound kind of counterintuitive that I'm going to start by talking about trees to avoid, trees and shrubs to avoid, because if we understand why we're avoiding them, the rest really becomes quite clear. Our native trees and shrubs have existed for thousands of years, and relationships have developed between our native plants and our wildlife over millions of years. So therefore, if we start bringing in species which are not native, then we're doing an awful lot of harm to wildlife. I'm going to choose one of my favourites. I know you've heard me mention it before, but it's a classic example. If we take the buddleia. Now the buddleia is excellent as a nectar source for lots of butterflies and moths and many other nectar feeding creatures. The problem with it is that although it proves to be a useful feeding station, it's not really all that useful. As an addition to our native plants, then perhaps. Now the buddleia hails originally from the Chinese Tibetan borderlands, discovered by somebody called Per David, thus its specific name, Buddleia davidii, our normal sort of garden buddleia. Now if we live on the Chinese Tibetan border, then there will be many creatures that will have evolved to take the nectar, yeah sure, perhaps feed on the seeds, perhaps feed on the leaves, but we don't live there. And so therefore, we have very few, somebody might prove differently, but we'll be really hard pushed to find any animals which feed on the leaves of the buddleia. Therefore its contribution in helping a species is very limited. At best, it's a feeding station. In my own garden, just up that way, I have a very large sweet chestnut tree. Now that is something which I personally wouldn't plant. It's a lovely tree, and I won't say it's of no benefit to wildlife. The nuts are taken by such things as jays and squirrels. But you look at the leaves and you're really hard pushed to find any caterpillars on it. There are some, I do know that, but they're very, very few. The horse chestnut, even more so. The sweet chestnut was introduced into this country, well then nobody's really sure, sometime round about the time of the Roman occupation, or maybe even later. The horse chestnut comes from Turkey and areas like that, introduced, they think, about the late 1500s. Now, there are very few species which actually feed on the leaves. Yes, it produces a nice lot of flowers, and the pollinating creatures are fond of it, but does it offer a habitat for many animals? The answer is no. There will be some. You will find some things that will eat the conkers. But basically what I'm saying is those three species are, as examples, the buddleia, the horse chestnut, sweet chestnut, they're plants that I wouldn't plant. We've got enough of those around. We've got enough sources of nectar. We need to plant species that will actually allow our wildlife to thrive. I'm going to go straight to the top of the tree, the king of wildlife trees, the oak. Now there have been shown to be well over 1,000, some people say 2,000 or more, species which feed on oak. They'll feed on the leaves, on the buds, on the flowers, on the acorns. There will be creatures which live on the dead wood on oaks. There'll be creatures that live on the bark. So we reach a figure of about, let's say, 1,500 species dependent upon oak. Compare that with the sweet chestnut, you're going to find very few. And the oak, there even, I've seen a figure of something like 275 species which feed exclusively on oak. So if you haven't got an oak, there's 275 species which cannot exist. I've also seen the figure, whether it's exactly right or not, doesn't matter. Huge number of caterpillars which you can find on oak. A figure of 120 different species. Now that really matters, because if we have that range of caterpillars, then our, for example, blue tits, our willow warblers, all the species that we want are going to be feeding on those caterpillars, immensely valuable. Of course, many of the caterpillars will be moths, and if we want bats, then obviously the caterpillars of those moths will turn into the adults. We're providing bat food. Why have our bats declined in number? Many reasons, but partly because we haven't got the native species which are supporting moth populations. Okay, so the oak, hugely important. I've seen figures as well which say that they estimate 50% of the foliage on an oak tree is actually eaten. A vast amount. If we take hawthorn, I've got one right beside me here. The hawthorn, you will have wildlife which feeds on the leaves, they'll eat the flowers, they'll get the nectar, they'll eat the haws. So many species dependent upon it. I've seen a quote of 300 species feeding on hawthorn. So, which are the plants to plant? There are so many. If you watch my video on hedges, the ultimate wildlife hedges, I list many there, and all of those that I've mentioned play a valuable contribution. So which ones do you plant? It's a bit like asking which are your favourite children. They're all wonderful, and the greater variety we have, the better. Thus, my enthusiasm for wildlife hedges with a great many species in there. The more species of plants we have in there, the more animal species we will get. If we take a garden and we say to the gardener, name a few butterflies that you see in your garden, I'll bet included in there, not so common, but most people notice the brimstone butterfly. Lovely yellow butterfly, often see it very early in spring, and you find it throughout most of the year, most of the months of the year. And gardeners will often say, oh yes, I'll see it gathering nectar from such and such a flower they've got in their garden. Yeah, that's great, but have you any idea what the caterpillars of brimstone feed on? It's actually the buckthorn. I bet many of you, sorry, I misjudged there. Many of you are very knowledgeable, and you will know that buckthorn is not such a common plant. So if we want to help, let us say, the brimstone butterfly, it's of some value to provide nectar for it to feed on, but so much more valuable is also to provide the buckthorn. So which are the best species to plant? Well, the greater the variety, the better, depending on how much room you have. The oak is ideal. Obviously it grows into a huge tree. But you can, of course, prune it and keep it down to a reasonable size. The hawthorn, even if you've got a very small garden, it can be pruned to be kept as quite a small bush, but ideal if you can let it grow up and produce the stacks of flowers and berries that it likes. The willow is wonderful if you can perhaps plant it a little bit away from the house, because the roots can, of course, be rather invasive. Behind me here we have a magnificent hazel, terrific for many, many species, but the nuts are invaluable. And again, we think ecologically, don't we? So we know that the nuts are consumed by many things in the way of small mammals, and if we want to have birds of prey, we need to provide their food source. So really, planting hazels for birds of prey is great. If we want dormice, hazel, excellent. Species like the elm, disappearing over much of our countryside in Great Britain anyway, but a terribly valuable species, and if it's kept fairly low, either in a hedge or in a sort of bushy tree, not allowed to get too high, it will quite likely escape the ravages of Dutch elm disease. I could go on. Where do I stop on this list? Where do I stop on this list? It's a really difficult problem, because all of our native species have a role to play. The more that you can have in your garden or wildlife area, whatever that is, whether the more we can have in our churchyards, anywhere that you can influence things, perhaps the edge of allotments, anywhere, the more native species, the better. So my top picks: oak, hawthorn. I didn't mention, I don't think, silver birch, a wonderful plant. Willow, hazel, elm, but things like buckthorn, and of course things like the blackthorn. I'm going to refer you back to my hedgerow video, because really all of those species will be fine. You can keep them in hand, you can grow them in the way that you wish, so they're manageable. One thing I would mention that one of my subscribers wrote into me about was about, in fact, I regard this subscriber as a friend, we've been in touch, and she was inquiring about the value of hazel, the contorted form, the twisted one that you've perhaps seen around in florists often use the twigs. And such plants as that, I would try to avoid. Lots of wild plants, there are various cultivars of them. You can get a black form of elder, you can get a red form of hazel, you can get, as I mentioned, the contorted hazel, contorted willow. Are they of some value? Yes, of course. Would I plant them by choice for wildlife? Absolutely not. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, our wildlife has evolved over millennia to exist on our native plants. And if you start to introduce something like a red colour in the hazel, now that has been bred for the red colour. What else it's been bred for as a sort of byproduct, which you wouldn't notice, you don't know. So, is it as suitable for wildlife? Possibly not. I wouldn't risk it. I'd stick to the wild type. The other thing is, do we really want to be introducing genes, foreign genes, into our native species? I'd say most certainly not, because in breeding for the red colour, what other things have they been bred for? Perhaps unintentionally or accidentally. Now, I don't think we want to introduce DNA which is foreign to our native plants. We want the perfect relationship between wildlife and the plants, and they have evolved together over thousands or millions of years. We're not going to do better. So let's stick to the natives. So let's say we've chosen what species we want, and we've been thinking about the right site for them. How do you buy them? What's the best way to purchase them? Well, the cheapest way is to buy bare rooted. You'll only get them during the winter months when the sap is down, but they're very much cheaper. They're very easy to plant. It really just needs a spade, digging in the ground, given a little bit of a shake about, and just planted in a slot. And in the winter, they'll have time to settle in, roots to get established, and they're likely to go away fairly quickly. So although they're a lot cheaper and they may look a little bit insignificant, they will often take quite quickly, and they will catch up somewhere near pot grown fairly quickly. So, and especially if you've got quite a few to plant, then that really is the way to go. But sometimes I use pot grown, and the advantage obviously is that I can buy them at any time of the year, and although they're expensive, I do sometimes buy them because it gives you a flying start. You can get quite a good sized tree from a specialised nursery. I guess one of the most important things is that wherever you get them from, do make sure that they are native to whatever part of the world you're in. We don't want to be introducing foreign material. Sometimes these plants are grown in, say, warmer climates to make them grow more quickly, to produce a greater profit margin. Now that really won't do unless they are belonging to the country, ideally the area, but the country that you live in. Okay, the DNA matters. Planting bare root or pot grown, okay, the choice is yours. Obviously, if you're in an area which has rabbits, and unfortunately we don't have them around this particular part of the world where I am, then rabbit guards are a good idea. And staking. Could I just mention staking? Generally speaking, the staking only needs to support them right at the very base. So the ties which I use to attach them to the stake are really just to prevent them from the roots from rocking. The fact that the top bends and sways about is really quite a good thing. It will give you a nice strong plant. It's really just at the bottom that you want to stake them. And if I could just touch on here the siting as well. I planted literally thousands of trees in my capacity as a garden designer, and because I've owned a considerable number of wildlife gardens in my time. But siting is so important that they're in a position where they're likely to be able to survive. Often, now it sounds a little bit pessimistic, but often people will say, oh yes, I'd like to have an oak tree, but they're so slow growing. But think about where you're going to put it. Is it in a position where it's likely to be able to survive? Is it underneath, for example, or close to a power cable? If it is, then you're putting a limited life on it. But really, we should plant trees for future generations. And when we say future generations, I don't just mean future generations of humans, but if I plant a tree, I think about the vast numbers of future generations of wildlife that tree will support. So I've recently planted, in fact I planted it, it'll be 2 years ago now, pot grown, but I want an oak. Now I know that with the best will in the world, I'm not going to see that oak reach any size, but it's in a position where I think it's likely to survive. And if we can be unselfish, then the oak tree that I'm planting will outlast me, and after my day, at least I will have made some contribution to wildlife. And at the end of the day, most of us, I think most of you, are wanting to help wildlife. And planting trees is a very, very unselfish thing to do. It is a gift that keeps on giving. Going to touch on here the subject of threats to trees, and this is something I was particularly had in mind when I said at the start of the video that even if you don't have a garden or you don't have any space that you can have any direct influence over, there's a huge amount that you can do. Let me give you an example of something which happened close to me, an example of tree felling. Now, it's worth keeping an eye on what's going on in your local area as far as planning goes, because often members of the public have every right to speak in the protection of wildlife. Okay, specific example. Close to me, a developer, a landowner, felled an ancient oak. They felled this tree without any permission, without any consents, without any license. And I obviously didn't know it was going to happen. That land was not subject to any planning permission or application. But 2 weeks after that tree was felled, they submitted a plan to develop 2 houses close by. Now, I naturally was extremely hurt, annoyed, angry, furious. And I visited that site shortly after that oak tree had been felled. I'm sure many of you will understand how I felt, indeed still feel about it. Although that was a couple of years ago, I couldn't prevent that tree being felled. I had no idea anything was going to happen. I had no idea it was under threat. But I spoke vociferously to the planners, both in writing and in person, to complain basically that this tree had been felled, and then only 2 weeks afterwards a planning application was put in for the construction of 2 houses. This is terribly wrong. I'll cut a long story short, but at every opportunity that I had, I spoke of this tragedy, to the point where those landowners attempted to gag me with a threat of legal proceedings, which naturally, being me, you can understand, didn't make the slightest bit of difference. They tried to shut me up. Some thought that I was being vindictive, but I wasn't. I pointed it out to the planners. I'll do another video on this with planning, but unfortunately the planners often, I think, have insufficient understanding of what's done and the tragedy and the scale of the tragedy, and they also don't have enough teeth, because for me that land when it was pointed out to them that they had felled an ancient oak to make way for it, that land should have been blighted for any development. As it was, the developers, conservatively speaking, they'd had to plant a little bit of mitigation tree which might have cost them a couple of £1,000, but I expect they made something like £400,000 profit out of it. To say it is wrong is a drastic understatement, I'm sure you'll agree. We can also see what happens when, another example close to me, where a lovely mature silver birch, which I've said is a species which is very valuable to wildlife, growing in a churchyard and being about 15-20 metres high, I'd guess 50 years old. The owners of an adjoining house, which had been built about 4 years previously, made a complaint to the church commissioners, or whoever they are. The foliage of this tree was a nuisance to them. It was blocking their solar panels, or the leaves were falling, or something. And so the people responsible for the churchyard permitted that tree to be cut down to a height of about 6 or 8 feet, effectively eliminating it. Again, to say I was furious would be a great, huge understatement, and that's something I will not forgive and forget. The fault lies in the house owner for being so blind as to not realising that they had not got the right to claim the life of a valuable tree, and for the people that administer the church or the churchyard for permitting this felling. Surely we have got things so drastically wrong. I will also just point out one other thing local to me, and you'll find these examples close to you as well, absolutely for sure. A wonderful oak tree, which I mentioned in another video, which has been tidied. The dead wood, all of the dead wood, virtually, has been taken out of that tree, and it has been emasculated. No thought for the very large number of species which need that dead wood in the trees, never mind the aesthetic shape of it, but all the damage which has been done because the dead branches, I guess, might fall on somebody. I'm afraid that doesn't wash with me. If you want to spend your life standing underneath a tree with dead limbs on it, then that's up to you. But for most of us, a dead branch is not, in most situations, going to be a huge problem. In contrast, may I point out an oak tree at the other end of the village, which has died, has become covered in ivy, and is of huge benefit to wildlife. The dead wood creatures will be feeding on. We need dead wood, we need tree creepers, we need woodpeckers, we need all the flying insects whose grubs feed on the wood. We need the ivy to provide the berries for many species, the nesting sites, the protected places for our bumblebees, our moths and caterpillars and all sorts of creatures to hide in, our wrens to nest in. We need these things. So some people are doing the right thing. That oak tree, dead oak tree covered in ivy, is a marvellous resource. I hope they understand the huge value of that tree. Can I end this video with a couple of things? First of all, really important to me is to thank most sincerely those people who've watched my videos and have subscribed to it. I am so thankful to you for doing that, because I only make these videos not for fame, not for fortune. I don't intend to make any money. I've got no sponsors. I don't want any. I make this for the benefit of wildlife, and those people that subscribe to the channel, I value that enormously. To know that there are like-minded people out there means the world to me. So thank you ever so much for your support, and for those that have pressed the like button. Comments, I read all of them. I'm always very happy to hear from like-minded people. I'm also perfectly happy to hear from people who are not like-minded and who wish to criticize me. I read all the comments, I always take note of them, and I reply whenever I can. I get a huge amount of comfort from reading the comments that people make, especially if they're kind, and people who show that they're of a like mind, because I'm sure you've experienced it. Sometimes when I look around the gardeners, the landowners, I sometimes feel that I am a lone voice in the wilderness, and that we are light years of being in a position where wildlife is benefiting. I feel it's such a long way to go. So the comments really make me feel that I'm not alone, and there are others that share my view. Last thing on comments, I would appreciate greatly if you would comment on one thing. I am very, very passionate about wildlife, that I couldn't possibly disguise it. I do get very, frankly, frustrated and angry with the lack of progress, and frustrated and angry with things that I see going on around me. Here is the thing which I would particularly like you to comment on, is should I rein that back, and for fear that people will think, oh, there's that grumpy old, angry old man moaning away on the video, or is it something that you like to see, which is the expression of my own sincerely held views? Believe it or not, I often hold back considerably from saying what I really think. Is that right? Do you want to see the true, real, angry, frustrated, angry old man? Or do you want me to stick to the more advisory, conciliatory person? Because obviously there's no point in me making videos if the content of the videos is not to your liking. If you could press the like and subscribe if you haven't, I'd be most grateful. And if you could share the videos, I'd be especially grateful, because we need to recruit people of our way of thinking. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.